Excuse me. Welcome to Monkey's World. This is the review of the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was born in the small town of Clover, Virginia. She and her siblings were split up when their mother died, similarly to what happened to her own children. And she was raised by an aunt and uncle, and there was an older cousin named Day there. Henrietta's maiden name wasn't Lax, but there was an older cousin, like I said, named Day there, and it was not uncommon for the time period. You know, you're talking about the 30s, the late 30s and into the 40s. They got together. When she was 14, they had a baby, a son, and a couple years later they got married. They had 4 more children. One of their children was a daughter, Elsie, who was born with epilepsy and cerebral palsy. In that time period, you were put away. She was put away. They did things like drill into her head, take out spinal fluid and replace it with air or oxygen or helium, so they could see the brain better on scans. There's gotta be a better way than that. And she died at 15 in the institution, which used to be the Hospital for the Negro Insane or something like that. It later changed its name because of integration. And her autopsy report from the institution actually had a picture, which they never do. The guy was astonished, and of course the guy running the place comes running in and says, "What are you doing?" He said, "This is the family." And Deborah stands up, spins around, and says, "Here's my birth certificate, here's Elsie's birth certificate, and here's a power of attorney, you know, for the records." She was very smart in that way. Deborah eventually went back to school and became a nurse's aide. Or at least she was planning to. I don't know whether she got the chance because she died before the book actually came out. A few months before the book actually came out. So I'm not sure. She was young. She was only like 60, 61, I think, when she died. She was the second to the youngest. The youngest was a boy, and the mother had the cancer when she was pregnant. And she knew that pregnancy felt different. And, you know, and she told her girlfriends, something's different. And she didn't do anything about it until after the pregnancy, which makes sense. And one evening she got in the bathtub, and she was in pain, she was bleeding, and she felt like there was something there, like a lump, a knot, something. And so she inserted her finger into her body, and nothing sexual here at all. Went around her cervix. I don't know how she got that far, but She inserted her finger and went around her. It was nothing, like I said, nothing sexual. She went around her cervix and found the lump. And that is when she went to the doctor. Being in Baltimore, the only hospital that would treat a black person, because Maryland was right on the line between North and South, and I guess they leaned more South, sounds like. The only hospital that would treat a black person was Johns Hopkins. Well, probably because they experimented without them knowing. Evidently, it was common practice for them to take tissues and different things from black people without telling them to experiment on. And in this case, they did surgery. They biopsied the tumor. And they sewed up radium inside of her uterus to try and kill the cancer. This was horrendous. I can't even imagine that treatment. I mean, hello, a hysterectomy? Like, radical? Remove everything? And an oophorectomy? You do a radical hysterectomy and a bilateral oophorectomy. That's my opinion. An oophorectomy is removal of the ovaries. She had cervical cancer. It wasn't until years later that the biopsies were looked at, and it was realized that she had a different type than the type that they thought she had. But the treatment would have been the same. So, it's not really of any consequence. She had to have had it when she had her daughter and her son. To have had it to the extent that she had it that it killed her once. So, it makes me think of Joey and Rory, They didn't really have chemo for Henrietta or any of those things, Anyway, when they took the tumor and they had the cells, and the doctor put them in the dish with whatever soup and went off and did his thing, came back a couple hours later, looked in the microscope expecting the cells to be dead. Cells don't live outside the body, whether it's the human body, the dog body, the whatever body. They generally don't survive outside of whatever creature or critter they're from. And I'm not saying she was a creature or a critter. I'm just saying, because she was human. But they did these experiments on chicken hearts and all sorts of things. And they couldn't get any living cell to live outside of the human or critter body. That's what I'm saying, just to be clear. So he came back a couple hours later, looked in the microscope, and to his utter astonishment, not only were the cells still alive, they were replicating. He's like, what the? I'm sure he said, what the expletive deleted. But because it's a natural response, These are human cells and they're replicating themselves outside of the human body. How is this possible? And so they started using those cells, and they did all sorts of things with them. And the cells became known as the HeLa cell line. And those cells were used to they were used to test polio vaccines and to find the connection between HPV and cervical cancer, if you believe that. Let me try to explain that. They have decided that cervical cancer is brought on by the human papillomavirus. There are more human papillomaviruses than I can count. More strains of the virus. And that happens with a lot of viruses. So that's not unique to HPV. Many viruses, most viruses have a lot of strains. That's why we have to get a different flu shot every year. Because it's never the same strain of the flu. That's why we have to get a pneumonia shot with about a zillion different pneumonias in it. Same thing. So anyway, they believe that HPV causes cervical cancer. So they came out with the Gardasil for girls and for boys. And yeah, my kid wouldn't get that. I'm sorry, but there's something wrong with that. Vaccine, and it's not safe. Aside from the fact that not every woman that got cervical cancer had the virus, and supposedly the vaccine doesn't prevent all cervical cancers. So and they've also discovered, by the way, that ovarian cancer may not be ovarian cancer, that most ovarian cancers actually start in the fallopian tube, or what they now call the uterine tubes. They don't call them fallopian tubes anymore because they want to be more accurate, because they're the tubes that connect to the uterus. They're uterine tubes. So they've stopped calling them fallopian tubes in medicine. In fact, they believe that most ovarian cancers actually stem from the tubes. So, now, in one thing I heard she had ovarian cancer, and in another thing I heard that she had cervical. I think she had cervical, and it spread throughout her reproductive system, and then throughout her body, according to the autopsy. And don't think for 1 minute they didn't save cells from her autopsy, because I'm sure they did. And Purple Husband gets a call about 20 years later, 20-some years later, early 70s. And the way they're talking to him, he's not educated. They were poor black tobacco farmers from the South, and he had come up to Maryland following, I believe, his brother or his brother-in-law to work in the steel mill to give his family a bit of a better life. And they weren't educated. So when they said, we've been experimenting on your wife for the past, 20-some years in our lab, what do you mean? My wife is alive? No. Her cells are alive. What? And the children had to go on and educate themselves on what the heck all this meant. And eventually they visited Johns Hopkins and saw the cells. They got to look under the microscope. They got a microscopic picture, a picture from under the microscope, a color picture of the cells, framed. And, which is a small, what's the word? Not compensation, but it was just a small gesture, to do that. And so her daughter Deborah grew up worrying that she would get the same cancer that her mother got. I don't know that is Let's see what I'll put. Hereditary, necessarily. I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, please tell me. So, Henrietta had, like I said, 5 children. She had Sonny, Zechariah, which was not his original name. He changed it when he converted to Muslim. Lawrence, Elsie, and Deborah. And Sonny was David, I believe. At any rate, Lawrence was the oldest. He was the one born when she was 14, so he was like 18 years old when she died. Today, they could have at least given her more time, because they could have done a full hysterectomy. I'm not sure the outcome would have been any different, because she went through an entire pregnancy, which Joey did too, before she could do anything. I think they diagnosed Joey when her daughter was born. I could be wrong. And it was already spread. So, cervical cancer in and of itself is not aggressive. It generally spreads slowly, which is why we get yearly pap smears. I've had a hysterectomy, so, but I do have a cervix. That being said, the likelihood, if the stuff about HPV is true, the likelihood of me getting cervical cancer is next to nil. So, I'm not gonna worry about it. Where was I? Okay. The lady who wrote the book, Rebecca Skloot. Yes, that's her name. Skloot. Skloot. Is a science writer. She heard about Henrietta Lacks in school. She's 2 years older than me. So, she was in college in the 90s and heard about Henrietta in the biology class. She went and asked her biology professor after class was over more about this lady, and he didn't know anything. She said, "You've got to be kidding me." So, that was a time when she was finally getting credited with everything that her cells did. So, but our family was never compensated. I do believe they won a suit against Johns Hopkins, or, settled with Johns Hopkins. And Johns Hopkins has tried everything in the past, I would say 20 years maybe, to try to make it right. They have put her name everywhere. They have tried to make it right. The newer, group of doctors and researchers that have come in have tried everything to make it right. I mean, you can't undo the past, but you can certainly correct, egregious errors. And that is what Johns Hopkins is trying to do. They had quite a black eye on him, And it was also known that they experimented on black patients. That's one of the reasons they took black patients. And a lot of black people were experimented on. Tuskegee. If you're not familiar with that, they were a group of, once again, uneducated black men, because black people weren't afforded the same education, who had syphilis. And they went into this study. No informed consent. I mean, what the hell was that? Starting in 1932 and going all the way to 1972, where they had what they called bad blood. That's what they called syphilis. But they didn't tell them, they didn't try to treat them at all. They wanted to see the progression of the disease, the full progression of the disease. Well, syphilis is a sexually transmitted bacterial infection that, if left untreated, will eventually kill you, because it spreads through your body like cancer, and it goes to your brain, and you get what's called neurosyphilis. And there are different types. There's neurosyphilis is the late stage of syphilis, just before you die from it, which Al Capone had. He had neurosyphilis, and he died from syphilis. But you got to remember, they didn't have antibiotics yet. Al Capone's wife had what they called secondary syphilis. She got it from him, and their son was born with congenital syphilis, which causes mental disabilities, it causes physical deformities, it's horrendous. And syphilis is a horrendous disease. And even when they came out with penicillin in the mid-1940s, because they came out with penicillin around the time my father was born. My father was born in 44, I think they came out with penicillin around 45 or so. And that was totally by accident. They grew some mold on some bread in a laboratory. They got left sitting there over the weekend. When they came back, there was this mold on it, and they researched it. The mold became known as penicillium, and they discovered that mold killed certain bacteria, and that was the discovery of antibiotics. And they started making what they called penicillin, because it came from penicillium, from moldy bread. And so once the penicillin was available, it should have been given to them. But well, first of all, if it's already at neurosyphilis, penicillin's probably not going to help because of the blood-brain barrier. Anyway, but it wasn't. The treatment that would have cured them was withheld from them. And there is a movie about that called Miss Evers' Boys, which I'm going to watch. She was the nurse that took care of them. She was disgusted by the whole thing. World War II broke out, and the guys wanted to sign up. And they had to figure out a way to lie to them so they couldn't sign up, because they would be tested for STDs and be told that they had syphilis and be treated. Oh, one of my cousins. not sure if it's her. Uh, so they did not want that to happen, and they didn't want them to find out that that's what it was that they had, because they weren't really told, and therefore passed it on to their wives and children, without, their wives and their children that were born to their wives who had it, without ever knowing they were passing on a horrible disease. So the point of this being, they were all black and uneducated. And there were other examples of this egregious treatment in history. And the reason that they used black people, well, first of all, they thought less of them for the most part, and because they tended to be much less educated, because they weren't allowed to be educated. It wasn't that they weren't just as smart as any other white person, it was that they weren't allowed to be educated, because they didn't find them worth educating in the South. And Tuskegee took place in Tuskegee, Alabama. It was horrendous. In fact, President Clinton actually passed a bill for them, and they were given reparations. The ones that were still alive and the families of other ones were given reparations. I don't know exactly what it was, but I remember seeing the news conference where Bill Clinton apologized to them for the egregious treatment they got from their government. Because it was a government-funded study. Federal. Yeah. So, when you think about Henrietta, it was the same kind of thing. She was an uneducated black woman. So they never got any kind of consent from her, informed or otherwise. And they just took pieces of her, and they had been doing this all along, looking for cells like this. Because they didn't relish the idea of trying certain things on living people, so they wanted living cells that weren't a living person, which was hard to get. And like I said, they tried animal cells, and that didn't work either. Matter of fact, one doctor claimed that he kept a chicken heart alive, and he found the secret to immortality. Well, what they discovered after he died was they went into his lab, and he was dipping them into new cells, dipping the heart into these new cells, and it was keeping it beating for a minute so that he could take it on TV or whatever. He was a liar and a fraud. So, back to square one. And in comes Henrietta. Some of the information here came from the movies, some of it came from Bailey Sarian. She did a great video on Henrietta and talked about the chicken heart and all of that. Some of it's my own knowledge, like on Tuskegee. The dates came from the movie, though, for Tuskegee. Just so you know my sources. Just horrendous. And like I said, apparently Johns Hopkins had been doing similar things to other black patients. I guess the Lax family found that out. And even when they gave a name, Dr. Gay, G-E-Y, said Helen Lane. And I understand why he did that. Because of, well, medical privacy laws are very different now than they were then, but you still give some medical privacy. Not only that, I don't think he wanted the family to read it in the newspaper, But there was another doctor, thank you, Bailey, I can't remember his name, who actually told the family everything. Gave them a book, told them everything. Because he thought that they should know. And, told them about how the Salk vaccine for polio was tested on those cells, and she saved millions of lives. The Salk vaccine and a couple of other things that they were able to come up with through her cells. And the family's very proud of that, and they should be. And they recently, within the last week, won a lawsuit against a biomedical company that is still selling her cells. Initially, they were giving them away for free because they were replicating like crazy. And they're still replicating to this day. But this company was selling them, and they won the lawsuit. Like I said, I think Johns Hopkins ended up settling with them. I think that's what I saw in the documentary. But they actually interviewed her actual kids and stuff. As a matter of fact, the guy claiming to be a lawyer came to them and said, "We'll get millions." Then they get a call saying, "This guy's not a lawyer. He just got out of prison. He's a fake, a fraud." So they were very hesitant when Rebecca came along. But they did learn to trust her. I don't know if any of the money from the book actually went to Deborah's grandchildren or not, because Deborah was raising her grandchildren. So I don't know. But I would imagine that Rebecca made sure that they were taken care of. Because the book ended up a New York Times bestseller. So. But she had to pay off all her bills from all the travel that she did, and the hotels, and the food, you know, so she had to do that first, obviously. And I will say that Oprah Winfrey did an amazing job as Deborah in that movie. And she said in an interview that she didn't want to make a fool of herself or make a fool of the movie or whatever. You're a great actress, Oprah. Anybody that's seen The Color Purple knows that. So, that's what I said to the TV screen, to the computer screen when I saw the interview. Come on, Oprah. Anybody that's seen The Color Purple knows you're a great actress. So, and the chemistry between the two women was amazing. So, I believe it says right on the front of the book, now an HBO movie. No, not this one. Guide inside. Okay, what kind of guide? And the last thing I want to do is show you the cells. There they are. Thank you so much for joining me. God bless you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. I will see you next time. That is Mrs. Henrietta Lax. Said to be a strong woman. Loved her nail polish. Her children were her world. Her favorite color was red. She sounds like she was quite a force of nature. So, like I said, have a wonderful rest of your day. Please subscribe, guys. Bye-bye.